The crystal chandeliers of the Hartley mansion sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting a warm glow over the opulent dining room. Thomas Hartley, the silver-haired patriarch of the family, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his steel-blue eyes twinkling with pride as he gazed at his daughter, Emily. At 28, she was the spitting image of her late mother, all honey-blonde curls and emerald eyes that could melt the coldest of hearts. "Daddy," Emily began, her voice trembling with excitement, "I have some wonderful news to share with you tonight." Thomas leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped before him. "What is it, sweetheart? You know you can tell me anything." Emily's cheeks flushed a delicate pink as she glanced toward the ornate double doors of the dining room. "Well, I'd like you to meet someone very special to me. He's the man I'm going to marry." Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. His little girl, engaged? When had she grown up so fast? He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, the doors swung open, and a tall, striking young man strode in. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Thomas's eyes locked onto the newcomer. The world around him faded away, replaced by a flood of memories he'd fought so hard to suppress. The clinking of champagne glasses became the harsh clanging of prison bars. The aroma of tonight's gourmet meal morphed into the acrid stench of a dingy courtroom. "Mr. Hartley," the young man said, extending his hand, "I'm Jack. Jack Moreno. It's an honor to finally meet you, sir." Thomas felt as if he'd been doused with ice water. Jack Moreno. The name echoed in his mind, dragging him back to a time he'd give anything to forget. He saw flashes of a desperate man pleading in a courtroom, of a family torn apart, of a legacy destroyed, all because of his own ruthless ambition. With trembling fingers, Thomas reached out to shake Jack's hand, praying that his face didn't betray the turmoil raging within him. "The pleasure is mine, Jack," he managed to say, his voice surprisingly steady. As they took their seats at the table, Thomas couldn't tear his eyes away from Jack. The resemblance was uncanny, the same strong jawline, the same intense dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. This was undoubtedly the son of Carlos Moreno, the man whose life Thomas had systematically destroyed 15 years ago. Emily, oblivious to her father's inner struggle, beamed with joy. "Isn't this wonderful, Daddy? Jack and I met at the charity gala last month, and it was love at first sight. He's an incredible man, smart, kind, and so passionate about his work in sustainable energy." Thomas nodded mechanically, his mind reeling. How could this be happening? What cruel twist of fate had brought the son of his greatest victim into his home, into his daughter's heart? As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself trapped in a surreal nightmare. He laughed at Jack's jokes, complimented Emily's choice, and raised toast after toast to the happy couple. But beneath the veneer of civility, his thoughts churned like a turbulent sea. Did Jack know who he really was? Was this all an elaborate ruse, a carefully orchestrated plan for revenge? Or was it possible that Jack was genuinely ignorant of their shared history, that this was nothing more than a cosmic coincidence? As the dessert plates were cleared away, Thomas excused himself, claiming a sudden headache. He retreated to his study, a sanctuary of rich leather and old books, and poured himself a generous measure of scotch with shaking hands. The amber liquid burned his throat as he gulped it down, his mind racing through the events that had led to this moment. 15 years ago, Thomas Hartley had been a different man, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to climb to the top of the corporate ladder. Carlos Moreno had stood in his way, the CEO of a rival company that Thomas had set his sights on. Instead of a fair competition, Thomas had resorted to underhanded tactics. He'd fabricated evidence of embezzlement, bribed key witnesses, and manipulated the media. The scandal had been explosive, destroying not just Carlos's career but his entire life. Thomas remembered the day of the verdict as if it were yesterday. Carlos Moreno, once a proud and respected businessman, was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. His wife, a petite woman with eyes full of fury, had confronted Thomas outside the courtroom. "You've destroyed us," she'd hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Mark my words, Thomas Hartley. One day, you'll pay for what you've done." The truth always comes out in the end. Those words had haunted Thomas for years, pushing him to become a better man, to use his wealth and influence for good. He'd poured millions into charities, created scholarships for underprivileged youth, and transformed his company into a beacon of corporate responsibility. But no matter how much good he did, he could never fully silence the voice of guilt that whispered in the dark corners of his mind. And now, Jack Moreno was here, in his home, engaged to his beloved daughter. Was this the universe's way of extracting its pound of flesh? Had karma finally come to collect its due? A soft knock at the study door jolted Thomas from his reverie. "Dad?" Emily's voice called out. "Are you okay?" Thomas quickly composed himself, straightening his tie and plastering on a smile. "Come in, sweetheart. I'm fine, just a little overwhelmed by the news." Emily entered, her face etched with concern. "I know it's a lot to take in, Daddy. But I hope you can see how happy Jack makes me. He's truly amazing, and I can't wait for you to get to know him better." Thomas felt his heart constrict. How could he tell her the truth? How could he shatter her happiness with the sins of his past? "Of course, darling," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm just so happy for you. Jack seems like a fine young man." As Emily left the study, her face glowing with joy, Thomas felt the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like never before. He knew he had a choice to make: confront Jack and risk losing everything, or bury the past once and for all and pray that it stayed buried. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. As he stared out the window into the inky darkness of the night, Thomas Hartley couldn't shake the feeling that his past had finally caught up with him, and it was wearing the face of his future son-in-law. In the guest room across the mansion, Jack Moreno stood before the mirror, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that would have chilled Thomas to the bone had he seen it. A small, satisfied smile played on his lips as he fingered the small, worn photograph hidden in his wallet. A picture of a broken man in a prison jumpsuit, his eyes full of pain and betrayal. "I'm here, Dad," Jack whispered to the photograph. "I'm finally here, and Thomas Hartley won't know what hit him." The stage was set, the players in position. As the Hartley mansion settled into an uneasy silence, the first act of a drama 15 years in the making was about to unfold. A tale of love, revenge, and redemption that would leave no one unscathed. The following week passed in a blur of celebration and barely concealed anxiety for Thomas Hartley. Emily, caught up in the whirlwind of her engagement, failed to notice the strain in her father's smile or the dark circles forming under his eyes. Each night, as the mansion settled into silence, Thomas found himself in his study, a tumbler of scotch in hand, staring at old newspaper clippings and court documents he'd vowed never to look at again. The headlines screamed at him from the yellowed pages. Tech mogul Carlos Moreno convicted of embezzlement, Moreno Industries collapses amid scandal, disgraced CEO sentenced to 15 years. Each word was a dagger to Thomas's conscience, a reminder of the man he used to be and the lives he had destroyed in his relentless pursuit of success. As dawn broke on the 7th day since Jack's introduction to the family, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't live with this gnawing uncertainty any longer. He needed to know if Jack was aware of their shared history, and if so, what his true intentions were with Emily. With trembling hands, Thomas dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Rogers? It's Hartley. I need you to dig up everything you can on a Jack Moreno. And I mean everything." As he waited for his old private investigator to work his magic, Thomas threw himself into preparations for the engagement party Emily was insisting on throwing. It was to be a lavish affair, with hundreds of guests from the upper echelons of society. The perfect opportunity, Thomas realized with a chill, for Jack to expose him if that was indeed his plan. 3 days before the party, Rogers called back. "You're not going to like what I found, Mr. Hartley," the gruff voice on the other end of the line warned. Thomas listened in growing horror as Rogers laid out the facts. Jack Moreno had indeed changed his name. He was born Jackson Carlos Moreno, the only son of Carlos and Maria Moreno. He'd been just 13 when his father was sentenced, old enough to understand the shame and hardship that had befallen his family. "The kid's smart," Rogers continued. "Graduated top of his class from MIT. then went off the grid for a few years. Resurfaced about 18 months ago with a new identity and a job at a tech startup. But here's the kicker, Mr. Hartley, that startup? It's a subsidiary of one of your companies. The boy's been working for you this whole time. Thomas felt the room spin around him. Jack had been right under his nose for over a year, carefully positioning himself for, what? Revenge? Exposure? Or something even more sinister? There's more, Rogers added, his voice grim. I managed to get access to some of his personal emails. Mr. Hartley, he's been in contact with his father. Carlos Moreno is due for parole in 6 months. The phone slipped from Thomas's numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a picture that filled him with dread. This was no coincidence. Jackson, had orchestrated this entire situation. But to what end? As if summoned by his turbulent thoughts, a knock sounded at the study door. Mr. Hartley? Jack's voice called out. Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss with you. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the confrontation he'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. With a deep breath, he schooled his features into a mask of calm. Come in, Jack, he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. Jack entered the study, his tall frame filling the doorway. In that moment, Thomas saw him with new eyes. The confident set of his shoulders, the sharp intelligence in his dark gaze. How had he not seen Carlos Moreno in him from the very beginning? Sir, Jack began, closing the door behind him. I wanted to talk to you about Emily's engagement ring. I know it's tradition in your family for the bride to wear her grandmother's ring, but I was hoping. Well, I have a ring that belonged to my mother. It would mean the world to me if Emily could wear it. Thomas blinked, thrown off balance by the seemingly innocuous request. Was this some sort of test? A veiled threat? Or was he reading too much into a simple sentimental gesture? Your mother's ring? Thomas repeated, buying time as he searched Jack's face for any sign of malice or deceit. Jack nodded, his expression softening. Yes, sir. It's one of the few things we managed to hold onto after everything fell apart for my family. I know it's not as valuable as your family heirloom, but it holds so much meaning for me. A lump formed in Thomas's throat. The genuine emotion in Jack's voice was unmistakable. For a moment, he saw not a potential threat, but a young man who had suffered immense loss that Thomas himself had caused. Jack, Thomas began, his voice hoarse. I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Please, sit down. Surprise flitted across Jack's features, quickly replaced by a carefully neutral expression. He took a seat across from Thomas, his posture tense. Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. I know who you are, Jackson, he said quietly. I know about your father, about what happened to your family. And I need you to know how deeply, profoundly sorry I am for the role I played in all of it. Jack's face remained impassive, but Thomas saw his hands clench into fists on his lap. So, Jack said, his voice deceptively calm, you finally figured it out. I was wondering how long it would take. Why? Thomas asked, the question that had been burning inside him finally spilling out. Why go through all this? Why Emily? A bitter laugh escaped Jack's lips. Why? You destroyed my family, Mr. Hartley. You took everything from us. My father's reputation, our home, my mother's will to live. Do you know what it's like to watch your mother waste away from grief? To visit your father in prison, seeing him age years in a matter of months? I swore I would make you pay, make you feel the same pain and loss you inflicted on us. Thomas felt each word like a physical blow. The guilt he'd carried for years paled in comparison to the reality of Jack's pain laid bare before him. But then, Jack continued, his voice softening, I met Emily. And God help me, I fell in love with her. Real, honest love, the kind that makes you want to be a better person. Hope flared in Thomas's chest. So this isn't about revenge anymore? Jack's eyes hardened. I wish it were that simple. I love Emily, yes. But I also love my father. He's getting out soon, did you know that? How am I supposed to look him in the eye and tell him I'm marrying the daughter of the man who ruined his life? The weight of the impossible situation settled over both men. They sat in heavy silence, the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel marking the passage of time. Finally, Thomas spoke. "What do you want from me, Jack? Tell me how I can make this right. Anything, name it, and it's yours." Jack leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I want the truth, Mr. Hartley. All of it. I want you to confess to what you did. The evidence you fabricated, the witnesses you bribed. I want my father's name cleared." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "You're asking me to destroy myself," he whispered. "I'm asking you to do the right thing," Jack countered. "To give my father back his dignity, his reputation. To give my family a chance at the life we should have had." The enormity of the choice before him made Thomas's head spin. On one hand, confessing would mean the end of everything he'd built, his company, his reputation, possibly even his freedom. On the other, it was a chance at redemption, a way to finally right the terrible wrong he'd committed all those years ago. And Emily, dear God, what would this do to Emily? As if reading his thoughts, Jack spoke again, his voice softer now. "I love your daughter, Mr. Hartley. More than I ever thought possible. I don't want to hurt her. But I can't build a life with her on a foundation of lies and injustice. She deserves better than that. We all do." Thomas stood up abruptly, moving to the window. The manicured gardens of the estate stretched out before him, a testament to the wealth and power he'd accumulated over the years. Was he really willing to risk it all? He thought of Carlos Moreno, withering away in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. He thought of Maria Moreno, a vibrant woman reduced to a shadow of herself by grief and shame. He thought of young Jackson, his childhood stolen, shouldering a burden no child should have to bear. And he thought of Emily. His beautiful, kind-hearted Emily, who saw the best in everyone. Who had fallen in love with Jack despite the invisible chasm of history between their families. In that moment, Thomas Hartley made the hardest decision of his life. "Okay," he said, turning back to Jack. "I'll do it. I'll confess everything." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. "Just like that?" Thomas nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders even as a new one settled in its place. "It's long overdue. But Jack, I have one condition." "Name it," Jack said, leaning forward. "We tell Emily together. She deserves to hear the truth from both of us." Jack's expression softened, and for the first time, Thomas saw a glimmer of the man his daughter had fallen in love with. "Agreed," he said softly. As they shook hands, sealing their unlikely pact, neither man noticed the shadow that flitted past the study door. Emily Hartley pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp as she stumbled away from her father's study. Her mind reeled with what she'd overheard, a tale of betrayal, revenge, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Tears streaming down her face, Emily fled to her room, her world turned upside down. As she curled up on her bed, clutching a pillow to her chest, she was faced with an impossible choice of her own. Stand by the father who had raised her, but who had committed an unforgivable act. Or support the man she loved, whose very presence in her life was built on a foundation of lies? As night fell over the Hartley mansion, 3 hearts beat with the weight of secrets finally brought to light. The engagement party, now just days away, loomed on the horizon, a glittering facade that would soon shatter, exposing the raw truths that lay beneath. In his cell at Millhaven Correctional Facility, Carlos Moreno stared at a worn photograph of his son. His weathered fingers traced the young man's features, a mixture of pride and sorrow etched on his face. "Soon, mijo," he whispered. "Soon, we'll have justice." Little did he know, the wheels of that justice had already been set in motion, guided by the unlikely alliance of the man who had wronged him and the son who had never stopped fighting for him. As dawn broke, casting its golden light over the Hartley estate, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. The truth, so long buried, was clawing its way to the surface. And in its wake, it would leave a family shattered, a love tested, and the possibility of redemption hanging by the thinnest of threads. The day of the engagement party dawned bright and clear, a mockery of the storm brewing within the Hartley mansion. Emily emerged from her room, eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, her usual radiant smile replaced by a mask of forced cheerfulness. She'd spent hours tossing and turning, the fragments of the conversation she'd overheard playing on an endless loop in her mind. As she made her way down the grand staircase, Emily caught sight of her father and Jack in deep conversation near the entrance to the ballroom. They fell silent as she approached, and Emily felt a pang in her chest at the guilt that flashed across both their faces. "Good morning, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice overly bright. "Are you excited about tonight?" Emily forced a smile. "Of course, Daddy. It's going to be wonderful." Jack stepped forward, taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch, once a source of comfort, now sent conflicting waves of love and betrayal coursing through her. "You look beautiful, Em," he said softly. For a moment, Emily allowed herself to get lost in Jack's dark eyes, searching for any hint of the deceit she now knew lay beneath. But all she saw was love, pure, unguarded love that made her heart ache with the impossibility of their situation. "Emily," Thomas began, his voice strained, "there's something Jack and I need to discuss with you. Perhaps we could go to my study." "No," Emily cut him off, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Whatever it is, it can wait until after the party. Today is supposed to be about celebration, remember?" Thomas and Jack exchanged a look that spoke volumes, but neither pushed the issue. As Emily brushed past them to oversee the final preparations, she felt the weight of their unspoken words pressing down on her like a physical force. The hours ticked by in a blur of florists, caterers, and last-minute adjustments. Emily threw herself into the preparations with a frantic energy, as if by focusing on every minute detail of the party, she could somehow hold her crumbling world together. As twilight fell, the Hartley mansion was transformed into a glittering wonderland. Thousands of twinkling lights adorned the gardens, turning the expansive grounds into a fairy tale setting. The air was filled with the soft strains of a string quartet and the excited chatter of arriving guests. Emily stood at the top of the stairs, a vision in a shimmering silver gown that caught the light with every movement. Jack waited at the bottom, looking devastatingly handsome in a tailored tuxedo. As their eyes met, the rest of the world seemed to fall away. For one perfect moment, as Emily descended the stairs and placed her hand in Jack's, she allowed herself to believe in the fantasy. That they were just two people in love, untouched by the shadows of the past or the uncertainties of the future. But reality came crashing back as Thomas stepped forward to make the official announcement. Emily watched her father closely as he raised his glass, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "Friends, family, esteemed guests," Thomas began, his voice carrying across the crowded ballroom. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the engagement of my beloved daughter, Emily, to Jack Moreno." A ripple of applause swept through the room, but Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from her father's face. She saw the moment his composure slipped, the mask of the jovial host cracking to reveal the torment beneath. Jack is a remarkable young man," Thomas continued, his voice catching. "He's intelligent, driven, and most importantly, he loves Emily with all his heart. I couldn't ask for a better." Thomas trailed off, his eyes locking with Jack's across the room. The tension between them was palpable, charged with unspoken truths and the weight of their shared secret. Emily felt her heart racing, knowing that this was the moment everything could unravel. She stepped forward, plastering on her brightest smile. "What my father is trying to say," she interjected smoothly, "is that we're overjoyed to share this moment with all of you. Jack and I can't wait to start our life together." The crowd broke into enthusiastic applause, the moment of awkwardness forgotten. As guests swarmed forward to offer their congratulations, Emily felt Jack's arm slip around her waist, pulling her close. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Emily turned to him, searching his face. In that moment, she made a decision. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Now." Without waiting for a response, Emily took Jack's hand and led him through the crush of well-wishers, out onto the moonlit terrace. The cool night air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. "Emily, what's going on?" Jack asked, concern etched on his features. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "I know, Jack," she said simply. I know about you, about my father, about everything. Jack's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. How? I overheard you and my father talking in his study, Emily explained, her voice trembling. I know who you really are, why you're really here. What I don't know is, was any of it real? Us, I mean. Jack reached for her, but Emily stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. Emily, please, he pleaded. You have to believe me. Yes, I came here with ulterior motives. But falling in love with you? That was never part of the plan. It's the most real thing I've ever felt. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. How can I believe you? How can I trust anything when our entire relationship is built on lies? Before Jack could respond, a commotion from inside the ballroom caught their attention. They rushed back inside to find a scene of chaos unfolding. Thomas Hartley stood in the center of the room, his face ashen, surrounded by a sea of confused and concerned faces. I have something I need to say, he announced, his voice ringing out over the murmurs of the crowd. Something I should have said a long time ago. Emily felt her heart drop. Daddy, no, she whispered, but it was too late. 15 years ago, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, I committed a terrible crime. I framed an innocent man, Carlos Moreno, for embezzlement. I fabricated evidence, I bribed witnesses, I destroyed a good man's life for my own gain. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emily saw shock, disgust, and disbelief play across the faces of their friends and business associates. She felt Jack tense beside her, his hand finding hers and squeezing tightly. I've lived with this guilt for 15 years, Thomas went on, his eyes finding Emily's in the crowd. I convinced myself that if I did enough good, if I gave enough to charity, somehow it would balance the scales. But I was wrong. Nothing can erase what I've done. He turned to Jack then, and Emily saw a lifetime of regret etched in the lines of her father's face. Jack Moreno is not just my daughter's fiancé. He is the son of the man I wronged. And he has shown me more grace and forgiveness than I deserve. The room erupted into chaos. Phones were pulled out, furious whispers flew back and forth, and more than a few guests made hasty exits. Emily stood frozen, torn between rushing to her father's side and fleeing from the nightmare her perfect evening had become. It was Jack who moved first, striding purposefully across the room to stand beside Thomas. Mr. Hartley has done a brave thing tonight, he addressed the stunned crowd. He's taken the first step towards righting a terrible wrong. I ask all of you to remember that courage, that willingness to face the consequences of one's actions, when you judge him in the days to come. Emily felt a surge of love and pride for Jack in that moment, even as her world continued to crumble around her. She made her way through the crowd to join her father and fiancé, presenting a united front to the sea of shocked faces. As security began ushering out the remaining guests, Emily turned to her father. Daddy, she began, her voice choked with emotion. Thomas pulled her into a fierce embrace. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, he murmured into her hair. I never wanted you to be hurt by my mistakes. Over her father's shoulder, Emily's eyes met Jack's. She saw the love there, the regret, the hope for forgiveness. But she also saw the long road ahead of them, the challenges they would face in the wake of tonight's revelations. As the last of the guests departed, leaving the three of them alone in the cavernous ballroom, Emily took a deep breath. I think, she said slowly, that it's time we all sat down and had a very long, very honest conversation. Thomas and Jack nodded in agreement, and together they made their way to the study, the very room where Emily's world had first begun to unravel. As they settled into the leather armchairs, a heavy silence fell over them. It was Jack who spoke first, his voice soft but determined. I think I should start at the beginning, he said. The day my father was arrested. As Jack's story unfolded, Emily felt as though she was seeing him for the first time. She learned of the hardships he'd faced, the burning desire for justice that had driven him for years, and the internal conflict he'd struggled with since falling in love with her. Thomas, too, opened up in a way he never had before. He spoke of the ruthless ambition that had consumed him, the moment he realized the magnitude of what he'd done, and the years of silent penance he'd imposed on himself. Hours passed, tears were shed, and hard truths were faced. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Emily found herself emotionally exhausted but with a newfound clarity. "I love you both," she said, looking from her father to Jack. "And I believe in second chances. But trust is going to take time to rebuild." Thomas nodded, a sad smile on his face. "I understand, sweetheart. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn back your trust, and to make amends for what I've done." Jack reached for Emily's hand, his touch tentative. "Where do we go from here?" he asked softly. Emily took a deep breath, weighing her words carefully. "First, we need to clear your father's name, Jack." "Daddy, I assume you're prepared to go to the authorities?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "First thing Monday morning. My lawyers are already drawing up a full confession." "Good," Emily continued. "Then we need to talk to your father, Jack. He deserves to hear the truth from us, not from the media circus that's sure to follow." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd come with me to see him?" Emily squeezed his hand. "Of course. We're in this together now, all of us." As they continued to talk, making plans and facing the realities of the days to come, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. But for the first time, they were facing it all with complete honesty. Later that morning, as Emily stood on the terrace watching the sun rise fully over the Hartley estate, she felt Jack's presence behind her before he spoke. "I meant what I said last night," he said quietly. "Falling in love with you was never part of my plan. But it's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Emily turned to face him, taking in the earnest expression on his face, the love and hope shining in his eyes. "I believe you," she said softly. "And I love you too. But Jack, we have a long way to go." He nodded, understanding the unspoken words. "I know, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to prove myself to you, to earn your trust completely." Emily reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "We'll do it together," she said. "Day by day, step by step." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Emily knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their story. A chapter filled with challenges, yes, but also with the promise of a love strengthened by adversity and a future built on the solid foundation of truth. Inside the mansion, Thomas Hartley sat at his desk, penning a letter to Carlos Moreno. Words of apology, of regret, of a desperate hope for forgiveness flowed from his pen. As he wrote, he felt the weight of years of guilt begin to lift, replaced by a determination to right the wrongs of his past, no matter the cost. The Hartley mansion, so recently the scene of glittering celebration and then shocking revelation, settled into an expectant quiet. The day of reckoning was coming, but with it came the possibility of redemption, of healing, of a future none of them could have imagined just days before. As Emily and Jack walked hand in hand back into the house, ready to face whatever came next, a new day dawned. Not just for them, but for all whose lives had been touched by the long-buried secrets now brought to light. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it together, bound by love, truth, and the unshakable belief in the power of second chances. The days following Thomas Hartley's public confession were a whirlwind of activity. As promised, Thomas turned himself into the authorities first thing Monday morning, accompanied by his team of high-powered lawyers. The media frenzy was immediate and intense, with reporters camped outside the Hartley mansion day and night, hungry for any scrap of information about the scandal that had rocked the business world. Emily watched from the window as her father was escorted into a waiting police car, his head held high despite the circumstances. She felt Jack's presence behind her, a solid warmth that both comforted and complicated her turbulent emotions. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked softly, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, turning to face him. "Let's go see your father." The drive to Millhaven Correctional Facility was tense and quiet. Emily's mind raced with all the possible ways this meeting could go wrong. What if Carlos Moreno refused to see them? What if he couldn't forgive Jack for falling in love with the daughter of the man who had destroyed their family? As they pulled into the prison parking lot, Jack reached over and took Emily's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Whatever happens in there," he said, his voice low and intense, "know that I love you. We're in this together." Emily nodded, drawing strength from his words and the unwavering look in his eyes. Together, they made their way through the rigorous security checks and into the visitation room. Carlos Moreno was already seated at one of the metal tables, his hands folded in front of him. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she took in his appearance. The years in prison had taken their toll. His once jet black hair was now streaked with gray, and deep lines were etched around his eyes and mouth. But there was a fire in his gaze that spoke of an unbroken spirit. "Papa," Jack said, his voice cracking with emotion as he rushed forward to embrace his father. Emily hung back, giving them a moment of privacy as they clung to each other, years of separation and unspoken words passing between them in that single embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both men's eyes were shining with unshed tears. Carlos's gaze finally landed on Emily, curiosity and a hint of wariness in his expression. "And who is this?" he asked, his accented voice rough with disuse. Jack took a deep breath, reaching out to draw Emily closer. "Papa, this is Emily, my fiancé, and Thomas Hartley's daughter." The change in Carlos's demeanor was immediate and palpable. His body tensed, eyes narrowing as he looked between Jack and Emily. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No, Papa, it's not a joke," Jack said quickly, his hand tightening around Emily's. It's a long story. But Emily is here because she wants to help make things right." Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Mr. Moreno, I know that nothing I say can undo the pain my father has caused you and your family. But I want you to know that he has confessed to everything. He's turning himself in as we speak." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Why should I believe anything a Hartley says?" "Because I love your son," Emily replied without hesitation. "And because I believe in justice. What was done to you is unforgivable, and I want to do whatever I can to help set things right." For a long moment, Carlos said nothing, his gaze moving between Jack and Emily as if trying to piece together a particularly complex puzzle. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." And so they did. Jack and Emily took turns explaining how they had met, how their relationship had developed, and how the truth had finally come to light. They spoke of Thomas's confession, of the legal proceedings that were already underway, and of their hope that Carlos's conviction would soon be overturned. As they talked, Emily watched the myriad of emotions play across Carlos's face: disbelief, anger, hope, and finally, a cautious acceptance. When they finished, Carlos sat back, running a hand over his face. "I have dreamed of this day for so long," he said softly. "To have my name cleared, to be able to hold my head up high again. But I never imagined it would come like this." He turned to Jack, his expression softening. "Mijo, when you stopped visiting, when you changed your name, I thought I had lost you forever. To know that you were out there, fighting for me all this time." Jack reached across the table, grasping his father's hand. "I never gave up on you, Papa. Never." Carlos nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Then he turned to Emily, his gaze intense. "And you, Señorita, you are either the bravest or the most foolish person I have ever met. To align yourself with our family, knowing what your father did." Emily met his gaze steadily. "I love Jack, Mr. Moreno. And I believe that love is stronger than the mistakes of the past. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, that's for my father to earn. But I am asking for a chance to prove that I'm not defined by my last name." A long moment of silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Carlos extended his hand across the table. "Call me Carlos," he said as Emily took his hand. "We have a long road ahead of us, but perhaps we can walk it together." The rest of the visit passed in a blur of emotion and planning. Carlos shared his side of the story, filling in gaps and providing details that would be crucial in the legal battle to come. As the guards signaled the end of visiting hours, Carlos pulled Jack into one last fierce embrace. "I am proud of you, mijo," he whispered. "So proud. Your mother would be too." As they left the prison, Emily felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The meeting had gone better than she could have hoped, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of real hope for the future. But their challenges were far from over. In the weeks that followed, Emily found herself thrust into a world she had never imagined, one of courtrooms, depositions, and relentless media scrutiny. Thomas's confession had opened a Pandora's box of legal and ethical questions, and the Hartley name was dragged through the mud on a daily basis. Through it all, Emily stood firm. She attended every hearing, her head held high as she faced the sea of cameras and microphones. She worked tirelessly with the legal team, providing whatever information she could to help build the case for Carlos's exoneration. And each night, she returned home to Jack, drawing strength from his unwavering support and love. It was during one particularly grueling day in court that Emily received news that would change everything. She was sitting in the gallery, listening to yet another expert witness drone on about financial irregularities, when her phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Emergency at the mansion. Come home now." Emily's heart raced as she slipped out of the courtroom, her mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. Had her father suffered a heart attack in jail? Had the stress finally become too much for Jack? She burst through the front door of the mansion, calling out for Jack. She found him in the study, staring out the window with an unreadable expression on his face. "Jack? What's wrong? What's happened?" Emily asked, breathless with worry. He turned to her slowly, and Emily was shocked to see tears in his eyes. But there was also a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, a smile of disbelief and joy. "It's my mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's alive, Emily. She's alive and she's coming home." Emily felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. "But, how? I thought." Jack shook his head, still seeming to process the information himself. "After my father was arrested, she couldn't handle the shame, the loss of everything we had. She left, disappeared. We all thought she had taken her own life. But she didn't. She's been living under an assumed name in South America all these years." "How did you find out?" Emily asked, moving closer to wrap her arms around Jack. "One of the investigators working on my father's case recognized her from an old photograph. She's been following the news about Dad's case, and when she saw that the truth was finally coming out." Jack trailed off, overcome with emotion. Emily held him tightly, her own eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Jack," she whispered. It's a miracle." As they stood there, holding each other in the fading light of the study, Emily felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Yes, there were still battles to be fought, wounds to be healed. But in this moment, with Jack in her arms and the promise of his family being reunited, she knew that they could face whatever came next. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Maria Moreno was due to arrive any day, and Jack was a bundle of nervous energy. Emily threw herself into getting the mansion ready, determined to make Maria feel welcome despite the complicated history between their families. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the doorbell finally rang. Jack froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Emily squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Together," she said softly, and he nodded. They opened the door to find a woman who was unmistakably Jack's mother. Though the years had added silver to her dark hair and lines around her eyes, she had the same striking features as her son. For a long moment, mother and son simply stared at each other, years of separation and unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Then, with a choked sob, Maria threw herself into Jack's arms. "Am I Hio?" she cried, clinging to him as if she'd never let go. "Forgive me, please forgive me." Jack held his mother tightly, his own tears flowing freely. "There's nothing to forgive, Mama," he whispered. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Emily stood to the side, her heart full as she watched this reunion. When Maria finally pulled back from Jack, her tear-filled gaze landed on Emily. "And you must be Emily," she said, her voice warm despite the hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "Jack has told me so much about you." Emily stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Moreno. Welcome home." To Emily's surprise, Maria bypassed her outstretched hand and pulled her into a tight embrace. Thank you, she whispered fiercely. Thank you for loving my son, for standing by him through all of this. As they moved inside, the air thick with emotion and the promise of new beginnings, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. There were still challenges ahead. Carlos's case was far from resolved, and the scars left by years of separation and pain would take time to heal. But in this moment, surrounded by the warmth of family and love, Emily knew that they would face whatever came next together. Later that evening, as Emily watched Jack and Maria poring over old photo albums, their laughter filling the room, she slipped away to make a phone call. Her father answered on the first ring, his voice tired but alert. "Daddy," Emily said softly, "I have some news." As she filled Thomas in on the day's events, Emily felt the last pieces of their fractured world beginning to shift into place. There was still a long road ahead, full of legal battles and painful conversations. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Emily felt a true sense of hope for the future. A future where families could heal, where love could triumph over pain, and where the mistakes of the past could pave the way for a brighter tomorrow. It wouldn't be easy, but as Emily looked back into the living room, seeing the joy on Jack's face as he embraced his mother once more, she knew it would be worth it. With renewed determination, Emily turned back to her conversation with her father. "Daddy," she said, her voice strong and clear, "I think it's time we all sat down together. You, me, Jack, and his parents. It's time to start building bridges instead of walls." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then Thomas's voice came through, thick with emotion. "You're right, sweetheart. It's long past time. Thank you for not giving up on me." As Emily hung up the phone, she felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in months. The road ahead would be challenging, but with love, forgiveness, and the strength of family, both old and new, they would face it together, one step at a time. The day of the meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that hung in the air of the Hartley mansion. Emily paced nervously in the foyer, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress as she waited for Jack to arrive with his parents. Her own father, Thomas, sat in the living room, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic nervousness. When the doorbell finally rang, Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She opened the door to find Jack standing there, flanked by Carlos and Maria. The contrast between the two men was stark. Carlos, still bearing the marks of his years in prison, stood tall and proud, while Jack seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. "Welcome," Emily said, her voice warm despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Please, come in." As they entered the house, Emily couldn't help but notice Maria's wide eyes as she took in the opulent surroundings. It was a stark reminder of the vastly different lives their families had led over the past 15 years, one in luxury, the other in shame and hardship. Thomas rose as they entered the living room, his face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of their shared history seemed to fill the room, making the air thick and heavy. It was Carlos who finally broke the silence. "Thomas," he said, his voice low and controlled. "It's been a long time." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. "Carlos, I don't even know where to begin. I'm sorry, seems woefully inadequate." "You're right," Carlos replied, his eyes hard. "It is inadequate, but it's a start." Emily and Jack exchanged glances, both ready to intervene if needed. But to their surprise, it was Maria who stepped forward, her expression a mixture of pain and determination. "I think," she said softly, "that we have all suffered enough. Perhaps it's time we try to move forward, for the sake of our children if nothing else." Her words seemed to break the tension in the room. Thomas gestured towards the seating area, and they all sat down, the Morenos on one couch, Thomas in his armchair, and Emily and Jack perched together on a love seat. What followed was one of the most difficult conversations Emily had ever been a part of. Thomas, his voice often breaking with emotion, laid bare the full extent of his actions 15 years ago. He spoke of his ruthless ambition, of the moment he realized he had gone too far, and of the years of guilt that had eaten away at him. Carlos and Maria listened in stony silence, their hands clasped tightly together. When Thomas finished, Carlos leaned forward, his eyes boring into the man who had destroyed his life. "Do you know what it's like," he asked, his voice low and intense, "to lose everything? To watch your family suffer, to see the doubt in your neighbor's eyes? To have your own son change his name out of shame?" Thomas shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No," he whispered, "I can't even imagine. But you're trying to make it right," Maria interjected, her voice gentle. "That counts for something." The conversation continued, sometimes heated, sometimes tearful. They talked about the ongoing legal proceedings, about Thomas's efforts to clear Carlos's name, about the challenges that still lay ahead. Through it all, Emily and Jack remained a united front, offering support and mediation when needed. As the afternoon wore on, Emily noticed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The initial tension began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of understanding. They were far from forgiveness, but it was a start, a foundation upon which they could begin to build. It was Carlos who finally addressed the elephant in the room. "And what of you two?" he asked, looking at Emily and Jack. "Where do you fit into all of this?" Emily felt Jack's hand tighten around hers as she met Carlos's gaze. "We love each other," she said simply. "We know it's complicated, given our family's history. But we believe that love can be stronger than the mistakes of the past." "It won't be easy," Maria warned, her eyes soft as she looked at her son and the woman he loved. "We know," Jack replied. "But we're willing to fight for it. For us, and for the chance to help heal the rift between our families." Thomas cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said, addressing Carlos and Maria. "But for the sake of our children, I hope we can find a way to move forward. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I've done, if you'll let me." Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stood and extended his hand to Thomas. "I'm not ready to forgive you," he said honestly. "But for Jack and Emily's sake, I'm willing to try." As Thomas stood and clasped Carlos's hand, Emily felt tears prick her eyes. It was a small gesture, but it represented a monumental shift, the first step on a long road to healing. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and emotional upheaval. Carlos's case was reopened, with Thomas providing crucial evidence that would eventually lead to his exoneration. The business world watched in shock as the truth about one of its most respected figures came to light. Through it all, Emily and Jack stood strong, their love deepening as they faced each challenge together. They became a symbol of hope and reconciliation, their story capturing the public's imagination in a way no one could have predicted. It was a crisp autumn day when the final verdict was read. Emily sat in the courtroom, her hand clasped tightly in Jack's, as the judge declared Carlos Moreno innocent of all charges. The room erupted in cheers, and Emily watched through tear-filled eyes as Carlos embraced his wife and son, 15 years of injustice finally put right. As they left the courthouse, they were met by a sea of reporters and flashing cameras. Emily felt Jack tense beside her, still uncomfortable with the media attention. But it was Carlos who stepped forward, his head held high. "Today, justice has finally been served," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But this is not just about clearing my name. It's about the power of truth, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of redemption." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Emily and Jack. "It's also about the power of love to bridge even the deepest divides. My son and Thomas Hartley's daughter have shown us that it's possible to break the cycle of hatred and build something beautiful from the ashes of the past." As Carlos continued to speak, outlining his plans to use his experience to fight for criminal justice reform, Emily felt a surge of pride and hope. This was more than just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Thomas, true to his word, devoted himself to making amends. He used his considerable resources to set up a foundation dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals, with Carlos as its head. The two men, once bitter enemies, found themselves working side by side, their shared goal helping to heal old wounds. Maria threw herself into rebuilding her relationship with Jack, making up for lost time with a fierce devotion that touched everyone around her. She and Emily formed an unlikely bond, spending long hours together as Maria shared stories of Jack's childhood and Emily helped her navigate the changed world she had returned to. As for Emily and Jack, they faced their share of challenges. There were still moments of tension, times when the weight of their family's history threatened to come between them. But with each obstacle they overcame, their love grew stronger, deeper, more resilient. It was a year to the day after Thomas's confession that Jack proposed, again. This time, there were no secrets between them, no hidden agendas. Just two people, standing on the terrace where they had first pledged to face the future together, recommitting to a love that had weathered the storm. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, a far cry from the lavish event they had once planned. But as Emily walked down the aisle, her father on one arm and Maria on the other, she knew this was exactly as it should be. Jack waited for her at the altar, his eyes shining with love and promise. As they exchanged their vows, Emily looked out at their gathered families. Thomas and Carlos sat side by side, a sight that still seemed miraculous. Maria wept openly, her face radiant with joy. And in that moment, Emily knew that they had achieved something truly remarkable. They had turned a tale of betrayal and revenge into one of love, forgiveness, and redemption. The reception that followed was a celebration not just of Emily and Jack's love, but of the journey they had all taken together. Thomas stood to give a toast, his voice thick with emotion. "When I first met Jack," he began, "I saw him as a reminder of my greatest shame. Now, I see him as the son I never had, and the man who has made my daughter happier than I ever thought possible." He raised his glass, looking around at the gathered faces. "To Emily and Jack, who taught us all that love truly can conquer all. And to new beginnings, second chances, and the family we choose." As the night wore on, Emily found herself on the dance floor with Carlos. "You know," he said, a hint of wonder in his voice, "there was a time when I thought I would never know happiness again. But looking around tonight, seeing our families united, watching my son marry the love of his life, I realize that sometimes, the most beautiful things can grow from the darkest places." Emily smiled, her heart full. "We still have a long way to go," she said softly. Carlos nodded, his eyes twinkling. "Yes, we do. But now, we walk that road together." Later, as Emily and Jack shared a quiet moment alone, she leaned her head on his shoulder, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "when you first set out to clear your father's name, that this is where we'd end up?" Jack chuckled, pulling her close. "Never in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "But I wouldn't change a thing. Every hardship, every obstacle, it all led us here, to this moment." As they looked out over the twinkling lights of the city, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead would not always be easy, she knew. There would still be challenges to face, wounds that needed time to fully heal. But they would face it all together, bound by a love that had been tested in the fires of adversity and emerged stronger than ever. In the end, their story was not just about a shocking revelation or a long-buried secret. It was about the power of truth to set us free, the capacity for love to heal even the deepest wounds, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope and redemption are always possible, if we have the courage to reach for them. As Emily and Jack shared a tender kiss, sealing their commitment to each other and to the future they would build together, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter. Their journey was far from over, but whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them hand in hand, their love a beacon of hope in a world that sometimes seemed all too dark. And so, as the night drew to a close and a new chapter of their lives began, Emily and Jack stood together, ready to write the next pages of their extraordinary love story. A tale of passion, perseverance, and the transformative power of forgiveness. 5 years had passed since the fateful day when Thomas Hartley had recognized his daughter's fiancé as the son of the man he had wronged. The world had changed in ways none of them could have imagined, and yet, in many ways, it remained the same. The Hartley mansion, once a symbol of opulence and power, now stood as a testament to redemption and second chances. On a warm summer evening, the sprawling gardens of the estate were alive with laughter and the patter of little feet. Emily watched from the terrace as her 3-year-old daughter, Sophia, chased fireflies across the lawn, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Jack stood nearby, cradling their newborn son, Michael, named after both their fathers, Michael Thomas Moreno Hartley. "Hard to believe how much has changed," a voice said beside her. Emily turned to see her father, Thomas, his hair now more silver than gray, a gentle smile on his face as he watched his grandchildren. Emily nodded, her heart full. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is our life," she admitted. "After everything we've been through. Is everyone ready for the big reveal?" Carlos called out, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. The annual family barbecue had become a tradition over the years, a time for both families to come together and celebrate how far they'd come. This year was special. It marked the 5th anniversary of Carlos's exoneration, and unbeknownst to Thomas, they had planned a surprise. As everyone gathered around the patio table, Carlos carefully opened the box to reveal a beautifully decorated cake. Across the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Hartley Moreno Foundation, 5 years of changing lives." Thomas's eyes widened in surprise. "What's this?" he asked, looking around at the smiling faces of his family. Emily stepped forward, taking her father's hand. "Dad, we wanted to honor the work you and Carlos have done these past 5 years. The foundation has helped exonerate over 50 wrongfully convicted individuals, and your advocacy has led to real changes in the justice system. We thought it was time the foundation's name reflected the true partnership behind it," Jack added, shifting baby Michael in his arms. Thomas turned to Carlos, emotion evident in his eyes. "Carlos, I don't know what to say. Are you sure about this?" Carlos nodded, clasping Thomas's shoulder. "More than sure, old friend. What we've built together goes beyond making amends. It's about creating a legacy of justice and compassion. Our families are united now. It's only fitting that our work should reflect that unity." As Thomas pulled Carlos into a heartfelt embrace, Emily felt tears prick her eyes. The journey to this moment had been long and often painful, but the bonds forged in the crucible of their shared experiences were stronger than she could have ever imagined. The evening progressed with the warmth and ease of a family comfortable in each other's presence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Emily found herself seated between her father and Carlos, watching as Jack played with Sophia on the lawn. "You know," Carlos mused, his voice soft with reflection, "there was a time when I thought I'd never be able to look at you without feeling anger, Thomas. Now, I can't imagine my life without you in it." Thomas nodded, his eyes misty. "I wake up every day grateful for the second chance you've given me, that all of you have given me. The work we do with the foundation, it's allowed me to find purpose again, to try and balance the scales in some small way." Emily squeezed her father's hand. "You've done more than that, Dad. You've shown that it's never too late to change, to make things right." As night fell and the party began to wind down, Emily and Jack put their children to bed in the nursery that had once been Emily's childhood room. Standing over the crib, watching Michael's peaceful slumber and Sophia's gentle breathing in her toddler bed, Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. "Hey," Jack said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What's going on in that beautiful mind of yours?" Emily leaned back into his embrace, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was just thinking about legacy," she murmured. "About the world we're creating for our children, and how different it is from the one we grew up in." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We've broken the cycle," he said. "Our kids will grow up knowing the power of forgiveness, the importance of justice, and the strength that comes from family, both blood and chosen." As they made their way back downstairs, they found their parents engaged in animated conversation in the living room. The sight still amazed Emily, Thomas and Carlos poring over legal documents together, Maria and Thomas's new wife, Rebecca, exchanging recipes and gardening tips. "You know," Maria said, looking up as Emily and Jack entered, "I was just telling Rebecca about an idea I had for the foundation. I think we should start a support group for the families of the wrongfully convicted." A place where they can find comfort and resources during the fight for their loved one's freedom. Thomas's eyes lit up. Maria, that's brilliant. We could tie it into the legal aid program we're developing. As the conversation flowed, ideas building upon ideas, Emily marveled at how far they had come. The pain of the past had not been erased. There were still moments when old wounds would twinge, when memories of harder times would surface. But they had learned to face those moments together, drawing strength from their shared experiences and the love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Later that night, as the house finally quieted and their guests had departed, Emily and Jack stood on the terrace where they had shared so many pivotal moments. The night was clear, a canopy of stars stretching out above them. "Do you ever wonder," Emily asked, her voice soft in the stillness, "what would have happened if you hadn't decided to confront my father that day? If you had just walked away?" Jack was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her waist. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our life, our beautiful children, our families united, the work we're doing with the foundation, and I know that every struggle, every moment of pain and doubt, was worth it to get us here." Emily nodded, turning in his arms to face him. In the soft glow of the porch light, she could see the love shining in his eyes. A love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. "We still have so much work to do," she said, thinking of the countless others still fighting for justice, of the systemic changes still needed in the world. Jack smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And we'll do it together, one day at a time. Just like we always have." As they shared a tender kiss under the starlit sky, Emily felt a sense of peace and purpose wash over her. Their story, a tale that had begun with shock and betrayal, had transformed into one of love, redemption, and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. The years ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth and change. There would be more lives to touch through their work with the foundation, more battles to fight in the name of justice. But Emily knew that whatever came their way, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with love as their guiding light. Inside the house, in Thomas's study, a framed article hung on the wall. The headline read, "Unlikely Alliance, Former Rivals Unite to Reform Justice System." Beside it was a family photograph taken at Emily and Jack's wedding, the Hartleys and Morenos, once divided by a chasm of pain and betrayal, now standing together as one united family. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and a promise of the legacy they were building for future generations. A legacy of forgiveness, of second chances, and of the transformative power of love to heal even the deepest of wounds. As Emily and Jack made their way back inside, hand in hand, they knew that their journey was far from over. But with each step, they were writing a new chapter in their extraordinary love story. A story that had touched lives, changed hearts, and proved that even in the darkest of times, hope and love could light the way forward. The Hartley mansion, once a symbol of one man's ambition and another's downfall, now stood as a beacon of hope and redemption. Within its walls, two families once torn apart by circumstance had found healing, forgiveness, and a shared purpose that transcended their painful past. As the night deepened and the house settled into silence, the stars continued to twinkle overhead, bearing witness to the miraculous journey of the Hartleys and Morenos. Their story, born from a shocking revelation and a father's recognition of his daughter's fiancé, had blossomed into a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. And so, as Emily and Jack drifted off to sleep, their children safe in their beds and their families united under one roof, they knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, bound by a love that had conquered the past and paved the way for a brighter tomorrow. In the quiet of the night, the Hartley mansion stood tall, its windows dark but its heart pulsing with the promise of new beginnings, second chances, and the enduring power of forgiveness. It was more than just a home now, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most unlikely of stories can have a happy ending, if only we have the courage to fight for it. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, it marked not just the beginning of a new day, but the continuation of a journey. A journey of love, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. both those we are born into and those we choose. And so, the story of the millionaire who was shocked when his daughter introduced her fiancé came to a close. But in many ways, it was just the beginning, the start of a legacy that would ripple out through generations, touching lives and changing hearts long into the future. For Emily and Jack, for Thomas and Carlos, for all those whose lives had been touched by their extraordinary tale, it was a reminder that love, truly, could conquer all. That even in our darkest moments, hope remains. And that sometimes, the most beautiful stories arise from the most unexpected beginnings. As a new day dawned on the Hartley estate, it brought with it the promise of new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to spread the message of love, forgiveness, and second chances that had become the cornerstone of their united family. And so, dear reader, we leave them here, not at an ending, but at a new beginning. For in life, as in love, the most captivating stories are those that continue to unfold, page by page, day by day, heart by heart.